Kannan Gopalakrishnan. He was working as a senior architect at Engineering Design Research Centre, L&T Construction, India's largest construction company. He's also worked on projects ranging from institutional buildings to international airports, apartment complexes to aircraft hangars. He's also attended 3 international conferences and 2 national conferences, and is also presented technical papers at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and the MSRIT, Bangalore. He's also won the national championship at Archaman at the India's largest architecture quiz. Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan currently runs a design firm, Habitat Design Studio, and he is also a visiting faculty at the renowned architecture schools in Tamil Nadu.
Welcome back to UGC lecture series. This is AR 6602 History of Architecture and Culture 6. We are in Unit 1 Critiquing Modernism. We will be looking at lecture 3 now. In this lecture we will be looking at the writings of Robert Venturi and Christopher Alexander that shaped the future of architecture after modernism. We have so far seen what people have thought about and what people have reacted to modernism, and now it's time for us to look at what people wrote so that people started thinking about modernism in a different angle. Because we previously saw in the previous semesters that there were so many people who supported the rise of modernism and the international style. There were so many proponents, and the modernism as a style was being followed by a lot of architects and a lot of countries. You could see modern buildings almost in every country in Europe, in the Americas, even in the East Asia, Australia, everywhere you can see a modern building. Now let us see what famous people wrote about modernism that made people think away from modernism. Today we have 2 important writers and 2 important architects and writers. Both these gentlemen are more famous for their literary and critic work rather than their buildings, while Robert Venturi was also good with his practice. He has also received the Pritzker Prize, which is the highest prize in architecture. It's like the Oscar of architecture. So let's now get into what Robert Venturi is talking about. Robert Charles Venturi Jr. is an American architect. He was the founding principal of the firm Venturi, Scott, Brown and Associates, and he was one of the major influential figures in the 20th century. He was awarded the Pritzker Prize like I mentioned earlier, but in 1991 it was awarded to him alone, in spite of his request to include his equal partner Denise Scott Brown, also his wife. But the committee rejected the request and they granted the Pritzker Prize just to Robert Venturi. Venturi was a controversial critic of the blithely functionalist architecture and symbolist vacuum which he called the modernist architecture during the 1940s and 50s. He has been considered as a counter-revolutionary. He published the Gentle Manifesto, Complexity and Contradictions in Architecture, and a lot of other works in his lifetime. In 1966, Robert Venturi published a book. In the introduction of the book, Vincent Scully writes, "This book is probably the most important writing on architecture making ever since Le Corbusier wrote Vers une Architecture in 1923. Le Corbusier's work was supposed to be considered by modernists as the Bible of modern architecture, and Vincent Scully describes this book, Contemporary Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, as the most important writing on the making of architecture since that book by Le Corbusier. So that much importance being accoladed and attributed to this particular book. The postmodern architecture first emerged as a reaction, like I mentioned earlier in the previous episodes and also in the previous History of Architecture 5. Every style is a reaction against the doctrines and principles of a previous style. So right now we have something called postmodernism running, and in postmodernism was actually a reaction to modernism, to modern architecture, to international architecture, as expressed as by Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and a lot of modernist people. So the generation which came after that started rejecting those ideas and started going against those ideas, started reacting to those ideas, and that is when postmodernism was born. And this book was written in that particular time in 1966 when postmodernism was happening. In place of the modernist doctrines of simplicity as prescribed by Mies van der Rohe, which he says less is more, and the functionality which is being expressed by form follows function, and Le Corbusier's doctrine which says a house is a machine to live in. In the words of Robert Venturi, he calls architecture much more than that, and he calls it complexity and contradiction. Postmodern buildings would have curved form, would have decorative elements, would have bright colored elements, asymmetry, and features often borrowed from historic periods of architecture, colors and textures which are unrelated to the structure and function of the building, totally in a whimsical and surprise element nature, and those are the elements which makes postmodern architecture. And Venturi considers this kind of an elemental surprise element as inspiring and inviting into the fabric of architecture in this particular point of time. He rejects puritanism of modernism on one hand. He called for a return of ornament and accumulation of citations and collages borrowed from previous historic styles of architecture. Postmodernism heavily borrowed from classical architecture, from Rococo, from Neoclassicism, Viennese Secession, the British arts and crafts movement, the German Jugendstil, and a lot of other movements. Postmodernist building combined the new forms which have been evolved in the 1960s and 70s, and it mixed with seemingly contradictory nature of the classicist elements. If you see some of the projects designed by James Stirling, his Stuttgart project, he described the style as representation and abstraction, monumental and informal, traditional and high-tech at the same time. In this book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, he demonstrates through countless examples an approach to understanding the architectural composition and complexity and the resulting richness and contrast and interest that the building creates onto architecture itself. He compares with huge signages on top of buildings that calls for attention, and then he compares that to buildings that formed in form itself to create the monumentality effect. He draws inspirations from both vernacular and high style sources. He introduced new lessons for buildings of architects which are both familiar. For example, Michelangelo, Alvar Aalto, these are examples that are familiar, and he borrowed examples from these people also, and he also borrowed from the buildings of the then forgotten architects like Frank Furness, Edwin Lutyens, and all those architects whom they had forgotten comfortably at that particular point of time. He made an example that says the difficult whole rather than the diagrammatic forms of that were popular at that particular point of time. He compares a building which calls itself a restaurant with a board, and then he compares it with another building which is shaped in the form of a duck. In this picture you can see that there are two cases. In one case there is a building that is shaped like a duck, and in another case there is a building with a glass facade and it says restaurant on top. On the highway, this is the highway, this is the side of the highway. You can see this building which is shaped like a duck. It has doors and windows and everything, but it is in the shape of a duck. And on the other side, this looks like there is a huge signage that says it is an eatery or a restaurant, and the actual building is just a shed. It is a decorated shed. The building looks somewhat like either this, or there is a huge signpost and there is a simple looking shed on the side. So he compares these two examples, a duck and a decorated shed, and then he calls for duck buildings which are a little more acceptable than decorated sheds. Venturi includes examples which are both built, unbuilt, unrealized of his own work to demonstrate the possible application of all the techniques that he has discussed. This book which he had written has been translated and published in 18 different languages. Immediately hailed as a theorist and a designer with radical ideas, he went on to teach a series of studios at the Yale School of Architecture in the 60s and early 70s. During these lessons, during these theories, the most famous of these was happening in Las Vegas, where he along with Scott Brown and with Stephen Isenor led a team of students. They went on to document and study and analyze the Las Vegas strip of all the interesting buildings in that particular street. That particular point of time, it was probably the least likely subject for a serious research, because Las Vegas was supposed to be like the fun capital of the United States, and people don't go there for a serious research. People only go there when they are taking serious fun, not for serious research. So he took up such a controversial place, and controversial in a general sense, but it actually proved a lot of architectural value from his research. After the research was done, they published a book called Learning from Las Vegas, and all the findings of that particular team's work, were all published in that book. The book was published in 1972, 4 years after their trip to Las Vegas, and this book was revised 5 years later in 1977. He says, learning from Las Vegas, the forgotten symbolism and architectural form using the student work as a foil for new theory. In this book, he coined the terms duck and decorated shed. The descriptions was for two most predominant ways of embodying the iconography in buildings. In this book, he adopted the latter strategy, producing formally simple decorated sheds with rich, complex and often shockingly ornamental flourishes. The work of Venturi, Roche and Scott Brown adopted the latter strategy. They produced simple decorated sheds with often shocking and interesting ornamental flourishes. Next, we will move on to another famous architect and writer, Christopher Alexander. Christopher Wolfgang Alexander is a widely influential architect and design theorist. He is currently Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. His theories about the nature of human-centered design have affected varieties of fields of design, including architecture, urban design, software development, sociology and lots more. He has designed and personally built over 100 buildings, both as an architect and as a general contractor. He has also recently been invited to a program in Naples, a 1-year course at a university where students are supposed to explore innovations in ecological urbanism by building using the methods he had developed. So he had gone there and he has recently given his approval for that building. In software, Christopher Alexander is regarded as the father of pattern language movement. We will tell you what pattern language movement is in short. He wrote a book called The Pattern Language, and the first wiki, the technology behind Wikipedia, led directly from Alexander's work. According to the Wikipedia's creator Watt Cunningham, Alexander's work has influenced the development of agile software program development and Scrum. The entire Wikipedia was based on a technology which was made based on the pattern which was made possible by Christopher Alexander. In architecture, Alexander's work is used by a number of different contemporary architectural communities, including the new urbanist movement, to help people to reclaim control over their own built environment. However, his work is often harshly critical of much of contemporary architecture theory and practice, because he always keeps criticizing people of his own contemporary nature. When there is another contemporary architect building something, and he is more of an architectural critic than an architect himself. Alexander is known for his many books on design and building processes, including Notes on the Synthesis of Form, The City is Not a Tree, Timeless Way of Building, New Theory of Urban Design and The Oregon Experiment. His more recently published 4-volume Nature of Order, an essay on art and building and the nature of universe, is published much later and it is much recently published. In this new book, he talks about the newer theories of the morphogenetic process of architecture. He talks about the battle of life and the beauty of the earth. the implementation of his theories in large building projects in Japan is still underway. Alexander is probably best known for his book The Pattern Language, where it's a perennial bestseller and it is still prescribed book in many architectural schools around the world. And the reasoning that it uses simple and needs which a person requires as a designer, and the needs are then combined to form the language which is required for the architect to build. So, a pattern language is used to empower anyone who wants to design and build and to work in any scale, starting from the microest scale to the mega scale projects that are available. Christopher Alexander says, there is one timeless way of building. It is 1,000 years old and the same today as it has ever been. Great traditional buildings of the past, the villages and tents and temples in which man feels at home, have always been made by people who are very close to the center of this way. It is not possible to make great buildings or great towns or beautiful places, places where you feel yourself, places where you feel alive, except by following this way. And as you will see, this way will lead anyone who looks forward it to buildings which are themselves as ancient in their form as the trees and the hills and our faces are. Christopher Alexander talks about a way to build, a process of building itself, and he says that the process is timeless because this is the process of the universe. It is the process in which man himself starts evolving, creating structures and great places of architecture. It is a place in which we feel happy and we feel excited and we feel exhilarated, and those are not the spaces which people design consciously. Those are people designing places in a way which Christopher Alexander coins as the timeless way. He says that all these particular places have a quality, and that the quality, he tries to define that quality in many words. He experiments with a lot of words. He uses words from the language, from English language, and he tries to see if that is the quality which he is talking about. Unfortunately for him, none of the words available in the English language actually matches with the feeling that he is talking about, the timeless way or the quality. So, therefore, he calls that quality as a quality without a name. That is how he defines it. He calls the quality that makes buildings so lively and so lifelike and so interesting is a quality without a name. He discusses all these points in his book, The Timeless Way of Building. In his other book, The Pattern Language, Towns, Buildings, Construction, it described a very practical architectural system in the form of a mathematics formula or table, or a computer scientist might call it as a generative grammar. This originated from an observation that this occurs because they were built to local regulation that required specific features but freed the architect to adapt themselves to particular situations. They did not give any generalized theme or generalized format. This book provides the rules and pictures and leaves the decisions to be taken from the precise environment of the project. It describes exact methods for construction of practical, safe and attractive designs at every scale, from a regional level through cities to neighborhoods to gardens to buildings to rooms to furniture, and even fixes down to the level of doorknobs. The interesting part about this book is the fact that the architectural system consists only of classic patterns tested in the real world, but it is reviewed by multiple architects for beauty and practicality. This book includes all needed surveying and structural calculations, novel simplified building system that copes with all the shortages of materials, and it easily be stored by inexpensive materials, producing long lasting classical buildings with small amounts of materials, design and labor in a cheap manner. He says that all is possible, but if we follow simple rules of this generative grammar, all Christopher Alexander talks about in his book are syntax, grammar, sentence, words and phrases. We can use these words, phrases punctuations and all these things in a manner that fits best for the architect and for the purpose to create poetry. It first has users prototype a structure on site in temporary materials. Once accepted, these are finished by filling them with low density concrete. This method was adopted by the University of Oregon, and it was described as the Oregon experiment, which was published in 1975, and it remains the official planning instrument of Oregon. It has also been adapted in part by some other cities as a building code. The idea of pattern language appears to apply to any complex engineering task, not just to designing buildings, and it has been influential in designing software where different patterns are being used to document the knowledge that have been collected in the field. So, it has been used to a variety of fields, not just in design. Alexander's built work is characterized by a special quality which he used to call the quality without a name, but he actually names it as wholeness in his book Nature of the Order. This is the last book which he has written, and he relates to human beings and introduces, or let's say induces, feelings of belonging to the place and structure. He claims that the quality is found in most loved traditional and historic buildings and urban spaces, and that is precisely what Alexander has tried to capture with his sophisticated mathematical design theories. Paradoxically, achieving this connective human quality has also moved his buildings away from the abstract imageability which is valued in contemporary architecture. It is always being related to the medieval architecture or the thought process which were in the past. Also, the imageability which is usually associated with contemporary architecture is kind of lost in his buildings. That is one of the reasons why buildings are underappreciated at present. A pattern is a careful description of perennial solution to a recurring problem within a building context, describing one of the configurations that brings life to a building. Each pattern describes a problem that occurs over and over again in our environment, and then describes the core solution for that problem in such a way that you can use the solution a million times over without ever doing it the same way twice. In the pattern language book, there are over 250 patterns that were discussed by Christopher Alexander. The patterns starting from the usually the patterns are named in such a way that stairway that can be used as a seating, green open space, a park for 500 people, things like this which we can easily relate to. A waiting place. The waiting place could be anywhere from a hospital's waiting place or waiting place in front of an office reception, or it could be any place, but he calls it a waiting room, a space for waiting, and then he describes the quality that is required for the space for waiting, and then he describes the amount of things that we need to do in a space for waiting, and then if you could include all those qualities, we will always get the quality which is desired for in a building. In the timeless way of building, in that book, Christopher Alexander was talking about how buildings can be designed to become timeless. He was talking about a quality without a name, and then he asks us to find out what the quality without a name is, and this quality without a name is being defined as wholeness in his later book. He compares always his ideas with earlier examples where people feel happy in a particular place. In a medieval palace or a city or a church, there is a kind of ambience which makes the feeling of a person grow up. Why are we not able to produce that particular quality in modern buildings? So, that search made him write that book, Pattern, Timeless Way of Building. Whereas, in the pattern language book, he describes about 250 patterns, and he carefully names each of these patterns in a way which can be understood and applied by everybody. An outdoor seating is something which people can understand. A city for 50,000, town for 50,000 is something which people can understand. A balcony. These are some of the patterns which are there in Christopher Alexander's book. Also, there are about 250 patterns which Alexander is talking, but we can use that book as a reference material and we can start creating our own patterns. For example, if we can make our own patterns, let's say a place for watching cricket could be a pattern, or if, for example, if you want it to be a little more personal, you can say a place for oneself or a place for yoga. You can create your own patterns, and then you, for example, if you say you are going to design a place for yoga, then you keep on listing all the parameters that you need for a space for yoga. That will become another pattern to the existing 250 odd patterns which Christopher Alexander has defined, and you have added one more pattern to it. When you are designing a space, and you can take up randomly 5 or 6 patterns, and then if you mix up all those characters, you will get that particular place. Let's say you are designing a garden. You want exterior garden, you want a sitting place, you want a fountain, you want peace and calm, and you want a gazebo. So you can combine all these 5 or 6 patterns, and you can take pieces of information and pieces of missing pieces from all this to form jumbled, and then that is when you can create that particular space with ease. So that was what pattern language book was about, and let's quickly take a look at what we learned in this episode. We understood the writings of Christopher Alexander and Robert Venturi. We understood complexities and contradictions in architecture. We understood the timeless way of building. We understood pattern language. With this, you should be able to answer the following questions that are going to appear on your screen right now. Who was Robert Venturi? Name any 2 books written by him. Explain complexities and contradictions in architecture with sketches. Who was Christopher Alexander? Name any 2 books written by him. Who was Christopher Alexander? Name any 2 books written by him. Explain pattern language with examples. I hope you found this lecture informative and useful. I look forward to meeting you with more such examples and uses and more units in the further episodes. Until then, thank you.